Hi, my name is Kyle Steinfeld. Please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Christine Gaspar. And of course, welcome to Thinking Through Art and Design at Berkeley, Responsible Design from Bits to Buildings. Arts and Design Thursdays at BAMPFA is made possible thanks in support to the Big Ideas Courses program in the College of Litters and Science here at UC Berkeley, and from the generous support of Berkeley Arts and Design, and in-kind support is provided by BAMPFA. So I'd like to briefly introduce Christine, if I may. Christine is the Executive Director of the Center for Urban Pedagogy, or CUP, as we see here. She holds a Master's in Design, a Master's in Architecture, and also in City Planning from MIT, a Bachelor's of Arts from Brown University, and has been the recipient of a number of accolades and awards. For example, in 2012, she was identified as one of the, quote, Public Interest Design 100. So for those of us who may not be familiar, what is the Center for Urban Pedagogy? CUP is a nonprofit organization that uses the power of art and design to increase meaningful civic engagement, particularly among underrepresented groups. CUP projects aim to demystify issues in urban policy and planning that impact our communities so that more individuals can participate in shaping them. CUP goes about pursuing these aims through a variety of projects, some of which I'm sure that we'll see today, and all of which demonstrate a capacity to take on complex issues and break them down into simple, accessible, visual explanations. This capacity is unique to CUP among similar institutions, and is also an unmistakable quality of Christine as a person, especially for those of us who know her and admire her greatly. Please join me in welcoming Christine Gaspar.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to get to be here. I'm going to repeat a little bit of what Kyle said, but hopefully not too much as I introduce CUP. But we're a nonprofit organization. We're based in New York City, although we do work outside of New York sometimes as well. And our mission, as Kyle said, is to use the power of design and art to increase meaningful civic engagement, particularly among historically underrepresented communities. And the way that we think about that is that there are a lot of different barriers to engagement, especially to meaningful engagement, where people really get to be part of decision making that's important to them. And so we focus on the barrier of how hard it is to understand the public policies, the urban planning issues, and the decision making processes that shape so much of the communities that we live in and our day-to-day lives. And we do that by collaborating with community organizations and advocacy groups that are working on those issues in their communities, and with really skilled designers and artists who are good at breaking down things visually. And together we collaborate to make accessible, simple explanations of those issues so that more people can understand how they work and more people can be engaged in shaping how they work. And I'll talk about how exactly we do that today. You can see some examples of our work here. A lot of it is actually is really kind of playful and fun and friendly, and we try to really make it so that the projects that we do are really welcoming to folks around issues that are often kind of scary for them. The way that we think about our work is really focused on the people that we partner with. A lot of, I know that you all have done some talking and reading in the last week about kind of this general field, but a lot of the work in this space that's often called like social impact design or public interest design, we talk about it as community engaged design, often centers on the interests of the designers and the kind of way that they want to approach problems or what problems they want to solve. And so we're really interested in working in a way that's driven by our community partners. And so this is sort of like the formula for our projects. So it starts with CUP, but it doesn't start with CUP deciding kind of like, oh, what should we do or what's important to work on? It starts with us kind of building an infrastructure for organizations that are working communities to be able to come to us and partner with us. So that means getting the funding in place for the project so that people can participate in them. It means doing a lot of outreach about what it is that we do and how people can work with us. And it means assembling the team of staff who have the capacity to work on these projects. And I'll say a lot more about what that means in a little bit. And then the next step for us is really to find those partnerships. In a lot of our work, we do kind of open calls and we do a lot of outreach to groups so that they can come to us with the issues that they're working on. And this is really important to us. We frame our work as something called a resource ally model. And the way that we think about that is that the work that we do is kind of a form of technical assistance, but it exists to support the work that communities are doing. And so we want to center them in a way where they're identifying the issues that they want to work on, right? We're not showing up and saying, hey, this community has this problem, and we think it's a problem, right? That we're not trying to do it in this sort of deficit-based approach, that we're looking to communities to say, this thing is happening, we're struggling with it, but we also have solutions to it. And the work that you do at CUP can help us to realize our solutions, and so we want to partner with you. And so that's why we're sort of an ally with this specific resource of our technical assistance that supports their vision. And that's sort of like an asset-based approach to this work. So the finding like community partners is really critical to our work and sort of shapes everything else around it. And then the third piece is bringing in the sort of artists, designers, and other partners that can help us do this work. And then together we collaborate to create something. And all of our projects have these sort of three sets of folks at the table in conversation throughout. And one of the things that I think is important about this kind of work is that it's interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, but that we're not doing each other's disciplines. We're all bringing different kinds of expertise to the table, and part of the work that CUP does in facilitating these projects is making it so that each expertise can be expressed and that we can make a project that benefits from all of us being at the table. So the designers are still the ones doing design work. My phone is ringing. And the community partners really understand the issue on the ground, and they're also bringing members of their community into the project. So usually the community partners are community organizers or community advocates, but they're also bringing individuals from their specific community into the design process. So they are bringing their expertise to the table about their lived experience on that issue. And for us, one of the ways that we recognize that that specific expertise that needs to be at the table is that we compensate it. So we pay people for their time to participate in the projects. And then there's CUP staff, and we're sort of facilitating the process and helping to break down the information. And so together we create some sort of visually based tool that explains that issue so that more people can understand it. And then we get it out into people's hands so that they can actually use it. And the reason I sort of break it down this way to using this sort of formula is because that last image is the image that's about impact. But we can't get to that piece of impact without having all these other pieces in place from the beginning, right? So making sure we're working on an issue that's relevant and important, that we're working with the folks that understand it and that are connected to the network on the ground that would use it, right? So that when we get to the end, we know that we've made a tool that's visually appropriate, that has the right information, and that there's someone to give it to. So all of these pieces sort of have to be in place from the beginning. So that's sort of like the overview of it, and then I'll show you what that looks like in a few of our projects. One of our kind of flagship programs is something called Making Policy Public. We just celebrated our 10th anniversary in the last year. And the way that this program works is that, like I mentioned before, we do a lot of open calls. So every year we have an open call to community organizations and advocacy groups that are working on, a specific social justice issue that's impacting their community, that they want a visual to help them in their organizing work around. And artists, designers, illustrators, other kinds of visual thinkers that want to collaborate on that kind of project. And we have a jury each year that helps us pick the projects. And the jury is important to us because it's a way of having what we think of as an external accountability structure. And what that means is that, we're doing this work, we say that our work serves certain audiences, and we know that we have ways of working that, we think are aligned with that, but we also want to make sure that we're creating ways that hold ourselves publicly accountable to those values. And the jury is one way to do that. So we always have two people who are leaders in the advocacy and organizing world, and two people who are leaders in the art and design world that help us pick the partners that we're going to work with. And we give them the criteria for our projects, and we facilitate the jury sessions, but we also look to them to ask really tough questions and to really help us think through who we're partnering with and what makes a good partner, which projects will be really impactful. And they often know things that we don't know, and can help us understand the situation in a more complex way. And then this is what our projects usually look like when we start working on them. I always say this is what policy looks like in the wild. It's not really fun or friendly. This is one of many, many pages in a particular policy in New York State, which is the state's rent stabilization law. And the thing with policy is that there are maybe 3 different kinds of policy. There's policies that are intentionally hurtful to some communities. There are policies that are unintentionally hurtful to some communities, and then there are policies that are actually good and trying to support some communities. And this is actually one of the good ones. And one of the challenges with this is that, as hard as it is to understand, it means that it's hard for people to benefit from this being a really good policy. So in this particular policy, it sets out a series of rights and rules for people who live in rent-stabilized housing. And it does things like limit how much rent can go up each year, and gives tenants rights so that they can't be evicted as easily, or so they have recourse if their landlord tries to evict them. So it's a really important law. In New York City alone, this law is responsible for almost 1 million units of housing being more affordable than they would otherwise be. So it's really, really substantial. But a lot of people don't know their rights under this law, right? Like, it's really hard to go find this, 2,000-page law and read it and understand how it applies to you, especially when you're experiencing, your landlord threatening eviction. And this is the impact of people not understanding that. So this is a group of people being evicted from a building in Chinatown in Manhattan. And bless you. One of the issues with rent stabilization, right, is that in New York, as in many places in the U.S. now, rents are incredibly high, and so landlords have a really big incentive to violate the law and to take advantage of people not knowing the law. And so we're seeing all over New York City landlords who are abusing their tenants, right? They're shutting off the heat in the winter. They're locking people out of their apartments. They're doing really invasive, aggressive construction that actually makes it unsafe for people to live in their apartments. And the goal is to push people out, because every time they leave a rent-stabilized unit, the landlord can increase the rent by 20%. And often they actually try to pull the unit out of the rent stabilization program when that happens. So the impact of this is not just that particular family loses their housing, but also that any future family that would have benefited from living in that rent-stabilized apartment loses the ability to do so. So it's a significant impact. And in communities, lower income communities, and particularly in immigrant communities, we're seeing that happening even more, right? So people have less power, they're more marginalized in those communities. Landlords have a greater ability to push them out, right? They're preying on the fact that people are afraid to rock the boat. They're worried that, the landlord will challenge their immigration status, right? There are all these other layers of power that are impacting those communities. Fortunately, we have really amazing organizations working on the ground to organize around issues like this. So a few years ago, this group, CAV, Organizing Asian Communities, reached out to us around this issue. And CAV has a member leader model where they do power building with members of the community, and they train them to be leaders and actually run the kind of organizing efforts directly. And they do a lot of street outreach and door knocking, and they were seeing this issue with buildings happening throughout Chinatown. And they were also finding it really hard to talk to people about what their rights were, because it was hard to do it without explaining the sort of technical details of this particular law. And even though they were familiar with it, they found it hard to just even get into those conversations. So they applied to work with us through Making Policy Public, and we partnered with them and with a design studio called Intercollaborative to work on this issue. And I feel like if I had to have one slide about our work, it would be something that looks like this, because this is what most of our process looks like. It's a really inefficient design process. It takes a really long time. Because we're having a lot of these really collaborative conversations. And to me, this is the core place where we're sort of building the trust that makes it possible so that the project will work. Because what we need to do is, the trust that we create in this space is what makes it so that when we put out the final project and someone receives it in their hands, they have trust for that because of the work that we've sort of done on the back end here. And so what's happening in this photo is that the person on the left in the white shirt is Jason Chan, who's an organizer at CAV at the time. The two people next to him are two of the member leaders at CAV. The two people after that are two of the members of Intercollaborative. And then there's a CUP staff member off to the side, and I was taking the photo. And we're all kind of coming together around this table to have these conversations about the project. And we really start the project by having the organizer and the community members help us understand the law and their experiences with it and what's happening, and how they interact with the system. And then we start to kind of break down the information and think about how we structure it. A lot of the work that CUP does as an organization, or that our staff does in these projects, is to really help shape a narrative. So we're thinking about we're trying to understand from the community members, how do you interact with this law now? What is your perception of it, and how do you understand it? What are your fears or even myths that you experience around it? And we try to structure the project so that when they pick it up, it starts at that point. It's talking to them at the point where they are at. So we're not saying, hey, rent stabilization law is this thing and this is how it works. We're saying, hey, are you experiencing this thing? Let me tell you more about it. And it's structuring a narrative from that point A to the point B where they understand the law and they know what to do next, and they can take action and they feel confident in it. So that comes through having a lot of these conversations to really understand what those dynamics are. And then we're also talking about the visuals in this process, making visuals that are reflective of the community that we're working with and that are appropriate to that particular situation. And we have pretty in-depth conversations, and often we're working with community groups who haven't worked with designers before and might not feel confident having design conversations. So CUP staff are always trying to facilitate that and helping them to ask questions and sort of know how to engage in a conversation about design in a productive way. But then also helping the designers to understand how to engage in a space that's around, social justice and community organizing. And we have a lot of kind of interesting but tense conversations. So as an example, on this project, at one point we were looking at an earlier draft of the project, and it was sort of the same setup. The designers had put out a couple of different versions on the table, and we were talking about, what did people think about it? What were their questions about it? And so the two member leaders from CAV were speaking Cantonese, so Jason was translating for us. And at some point, Jason started getting really uncomfortable. And he's like, I don't know how to tell you what they just said. And we're like, it's okay. You have to be really honest with us. And like one of the things that we tried to do in these design conversations is when I was in architecture school, I felt like I was taught that the way to present design is that you go up there and say, look at this amazing thing that I made. I was not very good at doing, Kyle can tell you. And I feel like at CUP, the way that we approach that is we come forward with the design and we say, hey, this is what we came up with. What's wrong with it? We need you to tell us what's not working, what doesn't make sense. And so we really try to make that space where it's safe to critique and to talk about what needs to happen. So we convinced Jason to tell us what they said. And he said, well, they said it looks too Chinesey. And the designers were deeply horrified and apologized. But we tried to turn it into this conversation about, okay, what does that mean? What about it, right? And it was stuff that we could have seen, like as CUP staff, there were things that we were like, oh, that's a problem. But it was actually much more helpful to have the conversation come out that way, where the designers could hear it from the community members, right? And we got to talk about, the designers were trying to make it feel like it was about Chinatown and it was about this Chinatown community. So I'm pretty sure there were pagoda roofs somewhere in the visuals, and people were like, yeah, not so much. But we talked about, well, what does Chinatown look like to you, right? It's like, it was like 2013, right? And we're in Manhattan. And so people were, we had this conversation about which things resonated with them as feeling like it was about their community. And it was a really productive conversation that led us to the design that I think was effective. But that's the kind of space that we're trying to create in these projects so that we can have those conversations. And I think in my design education, we were not good about making that kind of space. And so I think that's a skill that we've been really trying to build into our work. And so this is the project that we made. So you can see no pagoda roofs. Instead, the designers really ended up using the building typology that you see in Chinatown, which is these old tenement buildings. And they use the idea of the building as kind of the visual structure for the project. So we do a lot of illustration in our projects. We really try to use the illustration to help carry the weight of the information too, so that we can use fewer words and make it more accessible, right? Especially when we're dealing with communities that might have might speak other languages better than they speak English, or might have, lower literacy levels. We really try to think about the work that the visuals can do in these projects. And then in terms of making it specific to the Chinatown community, this was a bilingual project, so it's in English and in Chinese. We always either led with the Chinese or made it larger, so people really felt like it was for them and it was speaking to them. And they might have seen things from the city that were in Chinese before, but they would never kind of lead with that. And we often talk about what is the appropriate tone for these projects, and there are times when we have partners that want something to actually look official, and there are times when they really want to make sure it doesn't look like it came from a city agency. So we have a lot of those conversations too about what would make people trust it. We had a project once working with street vendors where they actually asked us to make a more formal version of the illustrations than what their original draft had looked like, and it was because they wanted to be able to show it to police officers to say, actually, no, I'm actually following the law, and this is what the law is, right? So it's really important to think about, well, what's the situation where people will use this, and like what are the mechanics of those moments? So this is the project, and then it folds out. This section has some of the basic rights, again, using as little text as possible, using illustrations. I don't know if you can see them, but where there's those white and yellow bubbles, those were personal stories of community members who had successfully organized around their housing. And part of what CAV wanted to do was to help people see the success that they could have in organizing together as a community in these situations. And then it unfolds to a poster. And so you could see, again, we really tried to take the idea of the building and show different parts of the law kind of in the rooms where you might, or the spaces where you might encounter those. So really, again, using the illustration to help tell the story. And then this is, when we finish the project, this is CAV member leaders doing street outreach. This is in Sarah D. Roosevelt Park in Chinatown. And one of the first things that they told us was that as soon as they had it, they felt like they had so many more conversations because they'd be holding this thing and people would come up and take it out of their hands because they wanted to see what it was. So that was good. Since then, they've been using it for a few years now, and we've been hearing just great stories from them around successes that they've had organizing with this. They talked about a few buildings where tenants actually organized together to fight their landlord and get them fined, and actually in a couple of situations get the landlord to have to sell the building so that it could change hands and they could have a landlord that's actually more accountable. So, we're seeing real impact through the work that they're doing in this organizing. As a follow-up to that project, we got this other grant that let us make a subway poster using some of the content. And it was at a moment where a lot of communities were experiencing rent stabilization threats. And so we did this in English, Chinese, and Spanish, and then linked folks to different organizing groups around the city that could help them get support on those issues. We actually later did a project for the city based on this. The city's Department of Housing Preservation and Development reached out to us and said, we saw this work that you did with CAV, and we want to do a version of this. And we were a little bit worried at first because we didn't want it to be co-opted. And so we talked to them about kind of the parameters of what was important to us about preserving in the original project and what they were looking for. And they actually really just wanted to use it the way it was and add a new piece of information to it from a new law that had passed. So we ended up reaching out to CAV and saying, would you be okay with the city using this? We would work with you to, review the changes that they would want to make, and you would still have credit on the project. And we really framed it to the city as them recognizing CAV's leadership and identifying the need for this project, right? And sort of taking the lead from an organizing group and doing good outreach. So that was kind of an interesting experience for us. And now HPD has been distributing the project actually in several languages now. So just a few other examples from Making Policy Public. This is a project we did called I Got Arrested, Now What? It's a comic book guide to the juvenile justice system that's given out by the Department of Probation in New York, who was also not our original partner. We worked with a group called the Center for Court Innovation that works closely with the criminal justice system, and they actually were showing it to Department of Probation along the way to get their input on it. But this is a really interesting project because when kids get arrested in New York, as in many places, they sort of get fed into the system where they don't know what's happening to them, right? And they don't know who they're talking to. There's multiple lawyers that will come talk to them. They don't know that one of them might be their lawyer. One of them might actually be the lawyer that's arguing the case against them. It's really unclear to them. And there are actually many ways in which they can advocate for themselves in those moments, but they don't know what they are. And all of the existing materials were really, were either written for adults or were written kind of like pretty condescending ways to young people. And so we really wanted to write something that was kind of in the voice and in, a visual style that was easy to access and that would help them just be able to navigate those moments. This is the poster side of that project, and it's sort of a process diagram through the system. And it's actually showing all the different places in the system where you could be sent home, because there's also this sense for kids, especially kids of color who are often left in the system by themselves. There's often this sense that it's like, well, I'm in the system now, so I'm going to end up in some form of detention, and that's just the natural outcome. And so this actually helps them to see that there are all these places where they could be sent home, and so they can ask for and advocate for that. This is a project we did with a Nepali organization called Adhikar. A lot of their their members in their community, especially the Nepali women in New York, work in nail salons, and they were seeing really bad health outcomes for them. So they did like a participatory action research study with a group of nail salon workers, and they wrote a report about it, but then they wanted to turn that into information that could actually be used in that community and more broadly to draw attention to this issue and help people's well-being. So we worked with them and with a group, a couple of designers called Welcome Workshop to put together this project. And so it focuses on both the sort of like the rights of workers in regards to their health, but also some of their financial rights in terms of the hours and the way that they're supposed to get paid. And then there's a piece of it that also focuses on addressing consumers and talking about how you can be a good consumer in these situations and how you can actually support the nail technicians when you're using salons. And then this is a more recent one that we did. It's called It's Not Just Personal, and it's a guide to the rights of survivors of sexual assault on college campuses, and it's focused on women, that was not a word, women and gender nonconforming people of color. And we worked with an organization called Black Women's Blueprint. And this was a really interesting project because in a lot of our projects, we have conversations about representation and illustration and thinking about how to reflect people's communities to themselves and what's appropriate and what's not. And obviously, we get a lot of feedback on that directly from community members. And I think the designers here, like we ended up having a conversation around using the drawings and the line work and not just leaning on what I think often gets used is like skin color, like using different tones for skin color and saying like, look, now there's diversity. And we actually often see that even designers that we're working with, many of whom are people of color, that we often see that in the first draft of illustrations, all of the people look like they're white, even if we've had conversations about representing different races or ethnicities or reflecting the particular community we're working with. But there's so much of the work that people are doing in commercial contexts where that is the default that they get really used to doing it. And so we're having more and more intentional conversations about what are the biases that we bring into things like illustration and how do we think about those and how do we create moments to kind of check ourselves on that. But this project, I think there were some really great conversations about different ways that you can use illustration to actually really show a broad range of people. That's the inside of the project. And then I think that's almost all of the projects in the Making Policy Public series. Like I said, we've been doing it for 10 years. So we've, worked on a number of issues and, worked with a lot of different designers. You can see there's really different kind of illustration styles that we use. All of these projects and everything I talk about today are all on our website as well. So you can download like PDFs of them or you can buy hard copies of them, but everything is available for download as well. So Making Policy Public is it's a pretty long program. It takes almost a year to do one of those projects because of the level of kind of intensiveness of collaboration. So we started a program a few years ago called Public Access Design, and the idea there was that we would try to do quicker turnaround projects, so things that were smaller in scope that we could work on more quickly. And one of the ways that we'd be able to work on them more quickly would be to have a fellowship program where we would bring on a cohort of designers every year. And then every time we would work on a new project, we'd pull one of the designers from the cohort to collaborate on it, but we wouldn't have to do outreach because they'd already be in place. And so we turned that into a training program for designers. So it's a year-long program, and every quarter we do some sort of training or development work with those designers as well. Like our other program, this is also one where we do open calls and we have juries helping us select the partners. This is actually our first cohort, so it's a few years old now, but then we have this cohort of designers. This is one of the trainings. This is a community organizer named Matt Klein who was talking to the designers about community organizing, what the mechanics of it are, what it looks like, and how design can be used in organizing and how it really benefits, organizing. And he talked a lot about the different ways that he used it in his work and how he collaborated with CUP as well. But we're really trying to do that kind of training so designers can get access to aspects of this work that is not readily available to them, especially in more commercial practices. And then this is another collaboration. This is working with a group called New Immigrant Community Empowerment, or NICE, and it's also a situation where there's two people who are organizers from NICE. There's two people who are members of NICE's community. And then the other person is Caroline O, who was the designer who worked on this project. And this was a project that was looking at the rights of day laborers, Spanish-speaking day laborers in New York. So the two men from the community are day laborers. They were helping us understand the context of that work. And Caroline, when she was starting to work on the illustrations, she asked the workers to bring in photos from their job site. So this was another way to kind of reflect the community back in this situation, so she could both understand better what it looked like so that she could base her illustrations on it, but then she actually started using the images of the workers in the project itself. So, and this is one of the spreads from the project. This is a little booklet. So this is about this big. It's like a pocket-sized booklet for day laborers that helps them understand both what their rights are and then kind of what their recourse is if their rights are violated. This is another project in that series. It's also a little pocket booklet. This is called Get It Back. It's a project that we did with a group called Bronx Defenders, which is a public defender group. And one of the things that they found was that when people get arrested and then they're released, and they try to get their possessions back, like their wallet or their other stuff, that there were not consistent guidelines about how that should happen, to the point where people would be like, well, I need your ID. And it's like, well, you have my ID. But then people were losing, like, people wouldn't be able to get their car back, right? Because it was impounded somewhere and they couldn't figure out what the process was to get it back, right? So this was having real repercussions for people and their livelihoods. So they asked us to work on this guide. So we collaborated with them and with designers from a studio called L&L to make this little booklet. And what we found was that, so Bronx Defender started distributing it, but we found that the property clerk's offices and some of the police departments started asking for it too, because they wanted to have a set of guidelines too. Like they didn't have anything they could use or that they could communicate with people. And then about a year after we made this, Bronx Defenders called us and they said, can we update it? And we were like, yeah, definitely. Is something wrong with it? Did we get something wrong? And they were like, no. We were using this in our conversations with the city because we were trying to get them to actually change the way that this system is structured. And by having it actually written down, like what actually happens, they realized how bad it was and actually helped us in the negotiation. So they were changing the system now. And so we want to make a new version that actually reflects the changes that are happening. So it's really interesting because we focus on these projects as having an educational component to them where they can be used by the communities directly, but there's often these moments where they're helping to lead to policy change as well. So this will be the last program I talk about. Another piece of fun policy in the wild. This is one of the very many pieces of New York City's zoning code. And if you look at it, it's like this weird list of letters and numbers that's talking about like the different land use categories in the city. It's pretty confusing. This is what it looks like when the city makes a visual version of it. So that's good. So this is our version of that. I make fun of the city for this, but I also understand they have more information that they have to include on there. We're able to kind of sift out the stuff that's most critical to the communities that we're working with. So, we get to edit a little bit more than they do. But this is a page from a larger toolkit that we made that's called What is Zoning? And this is a little one-page handout that describes the different land use categories that apply in New York City and gives people sort of a shorthand to understand roughly what's being talked about when those letters are being talked about. And this is what the toolkit looks like. We're super literal about our toolkits. They actually come in toolboxes. But this is, it's kind of like a game. So there's a game board. And those, it's only one game board, but those are the two sides of it. So one side, the side with the little squares, is one where people can explore different concepts around land use and how land uses go together and how you regulate that. And then the second side is looking at individual building lots, and that's where we help folks to understand things like floor area ratio or other kind of concepts about the way that the size and shape of buildings work. And kind of the laws behind them. And this actually came about because we have, many different community partners that we work with. And several years ago, a bunch of our partners said, there's certain issues around land use development that we're always working on, like every year, year in, year out. We're always trying to retrain people about those issues because they're really complicated. A lot of them are kind of quantitative. and it takes us like an hour just to get people to understand the basic definition of something before we can get to the point where we're organizing around it. And they asked us to work with them to come up with a series of tools. So we started working on this series we called Envisioning Development Toolkits. And we did one on affordable housing, we did this one on zoning, and then we did a third one that's on New York City's land use review process, which is called ULURP. But the idea is that they're really hands-on learning tools, and they really they're very tactile. This one is made up of plastic blocks, so it's fun when you put it on the table, everyone immediately starts playing with it. But it's also like kind of building on the ideas of embodied learning, of how when people are physically interacting with something, when they're learning new information, that they're better able to remember it and to kind of envision the structure of it so that they can call on it later. And a lot of our work really builds on that idea in general, that we're sort of helping people build mental maps through this complex information so that they can recall it in situations where it's really critical to them. And then each of the toolkits comes with a booklet like this that the front section breaks down, again, visually breaks down a lot of the core concepts, the sort of technical concepts like this. And then the back section of each book are instructions for how to run the workshop. And we do a lot of training of organizers on how they can run the workshop themselves. We also run a lot of workshops directly. And then this is that particular workshop kind of in action in a few different contexts. So there's groups all over New York that are using this in their work kind of on a regular basis. And we actually just did a reprint of it because we had sold out from the first run. And then this is sort of a complement to that, but it's an online tool where people can explore this concept of FAR, because it's this very quantitative concept, but it gets talked about a lot when people are talking about rezonings or things that are pretty significant changes to their neighborhoods, and it's a pretty big barrier for people to participate in those conversations. So the goal of these workshops is really that people kind of understand the basic concepts and have the confidence to actually participate in community conversations where they, in the past, would have been likely to either get shut down really quickly or be told that they didn't understand the information so that they wouldn't be able to participate. And that's the whole series of toolkits, so the housing, the ULURP, and the zoning one. And then we also do, so those are our core work areas in our community partnerships. We also now do kind of more customized work because we've had so many different partners that we've worked with over the years. They often come to us now outside of the structure of those programs with the open calls and ask us to do kind of more specific pieces with them. So this is, right after the election, one of our partners, the Center for Family Life, reached out to us. They work a lot with immigrant communities, and they asked us to help them put together a series. This was a poster, and then we did a workbook with them that's helping families who are at risk of deportation understand how to set up guardianship for their children and then talk to their children about those issues. So it's really tragic that we have to do this work, but I'm glad that the groups see us as a partner that can help them work on those projects, and we're trying to kind of make we're trying to figure out our business model as an organization so that we're more able to do those projects that come up and that are really critical and time sensitive so that we can respond to those needs. And I know you all talked about this one, I think, earlier in the week, but this is another project that we worked on, and this is like a little bit different for CUP. I think it's more like a meta approach to our work, but I worked on this with a couple of folks outside of CUP, a designer actually here in the Bay Area named Liz Ogbu, and a designer based in LA named Teresa Huang. And we were really looking at the way that community engaged design or social impact design or public interest design actually goes down in the field. And we felt like, this is a body of work that's been going on for a long time. Like community engaged design really started emerging as a field like in the 60s. It's been around for a while. And we felt like when we would go to conferences or have conversations about the work, that it actually felt a lot like when we would go to conferences that were just about regular like architecture and design, where it would be like a group of white men talking about how awesome their work was. And we were like, wow, that doesn't seem like what we should be doing. And that whenever we would try to have conversations about how to hold ourselves accountable to our values and how to push the work forward and be more critical of it so that we could do better, we felt like we couldn't get anywhere. There was a sense in the field of like, if you're trying to do good, that's enough. That like, if you think you're doing your best, that's enough. And we think that's wrong. And we felt like it really came from this place of sort of like a charity model that we found problematic. And so we wanted a space to really critique that and start talking about it. Several of us were also involved in putting together this symposium that's called Design Futures Student Leadership Forum that happens every spring. That's for students like yourselves to actually explore some of these issues and learn some of these other skills that you need to do work in communities. Anyway, and we kind of kept talking about how do we find a way to talk about this in the field in a way that people can hear it. And we ended up, I don't know if y'all remember it. I know they still do this, or else I wouldn't say this because I would feel like I was sounding really old. But in Highlights magazine, they have like Goofus and Gallant, like the sort of side by side, like right, like one guy does the race. I'm getting a nod. That's all I need. Thank you. You know, one guy does like the right thing and one guy's kind of a jerk. And so we sort of started playing with that idea of like, oh, how do you take these practices and put them side by side? Because we would say like, hey, these are the best practices. Let's talk about best practices. And everyone would say, well, that's what I'm doing. And we would be like, I've seen what you do. But so we were like, how do we call it out in a nice way? So we started working on this project where we were really kind of looking at some of the, like, especially the tropes that we see in this design work, right? Where people are, you know, there's a version where someone's going in with good intention, but that, you know, it's kind of problematic, right? And then trying to show a version that was pushing that further and that wasn't just thinking about like, I'm doing good, but I'm actually thinking about systemically what's causing these problems and trying to build actually towards equity in the way, in not only the projects that I'm doing, but in the way that I'm doing those projects and engaging with all of the partnerships along the way. So we made this little booklet trying to do that. And it's been really fun. I mean, we've had it out for a few years and we're able to have a lot of conversations that are more self-critical than we did before. I think the use of humor in it actually really helps that. And I think that's something we think about a lot in our work at CUP generally, is like, how do you use playfulness and humor to make it a little bit less scary to talk about some of these things that are complicated and often terrifying. Yeah, and I don't know, so it's been an interesting process. And part of what we're also trying to uplift here is that, you know, when we're showing what Dick does and what Rick does, you know, the way that they're actually drawn as basically the same person. And we're sort of trying to say, we're all a little bit of both, right? And we've all done the Dick thing and the Rick thing at different points in our lives. And how do we make space to talk about that and hold ourselves accountable as a field doing this work? So I'll end there and happy to take questions. There's someone down here.
Oh, by the way, lovely talk. My question would be, you know, you have a variety of different design projects. Do you set like a timeline for each one, or is it just like it just happens to be, you know, one takes longer than the other?
Yeah, no, we always set timelines. That's a really good question because I actually feel like a lot of the ways that we think about accountability in the work is actually having a really clear process so that, you know, even when we start the project, we try to make really clear to everyone in the project what each of our responsibilities are going to be, what our timeline is going to be, and, you know, we try to hold true to that as much as possible. I mean, sometimes we have to have some flexibility, like we're working with our organizing partner. Sometimes like some crazy issue just comes up that's like a real, you know, a really important thing that they just have to focus on in their community, especially if they're a smaller group. And we try to make space for that. But we do try to hold ourselves accountable to the timeline as much as possible, so everyone kind of knows what they're getting into and they can account for it in their own work and make space for it.
Well, first of all, awesome talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering, we're here in California, which is suburban sprawl. I mean, we have pockets of urban, but really it's miles and miles of single family homes throughout California. How would this change if it was instead the Center for Suburban Pedagogy? I mean, because people spend more time stuck in traffic than with their neighbors.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I didn't name the organization. I feel like I'm often in a place to defend that name, but not all of our projects are actually urban. We've actually done projects with rural communities as well. So we did a project a couple of years ago that was with migrant farm workers in rural Pennsylvania. And so, yeah, I think the methodology that we use could be applied to projects in many different contexts, and I don't think it's specific to being urban. So let's talking about that and about our name right now. So
Hi. Thank you so much for your
Thank you.
great presentation. I was wondering if you could talk a little more about the importance of print in your work as opposed to other media, especially digital media.
Yeah, I love that question. We love print, and it's not just because we hate trees, but it's actually really important in the communities that we work in. So there's definitely still a digital divide for sure, and even in the communities we work in, there's very high cell phone use, but it's not always smartphone use, right? And there's still it's still often data is really expensive in the way that people are accessing it. So just the affordability and like accessibility of print is really critical. We're working a lot with community organizers, and often the models that they're using work really well with print, right? Where they're running training sessions or they're doing street outreach, and they can put a thing in someone's hand and give it to them, or they can look at it together and kind of like talk about parts of it. So often, actually, when we're working, especially the groups that do a lot of door knocking, we think about the mechanics of how the projects unfold, and they might talk about, oh, these are the things I talk about when I'm in the doorway with them. And then I give it to them and they can open it up and look at the other stuff later. So just even thinking about the design of those pieces. But also there's also like a changing hands. Like we did a project a few years ago that was on the rights of domestic workers. And so I know that like nannies were a big audience within that. And what would happen was that one of the, organizing, a nanny that was also organizing within the group we were working with would take a stack of them to the park, and she would like hand them out to other nannies, and then a nanny would hand it to another nanny that she knew. But even more than that, I think what's really critical is that people feel like when they have the print material, they know that it's there, and they can take it with them. So we always hear stories from our community partners about someone pulling it out to show someone when they were trying to enact their right. So there was this one story from a group we work with called Housing Court Answers, where we had made this little guide to housing court. And so in New York, up until very recently in New York, if you went to housing court, you went on your own. But when you got there, you were talking to your landlord's lawyer, even though you didn't have a lawyer. And you would probably end up talking to them in the hallway rather than even going into the courtroom. And so like Housing Court Answers was talking about how they had this one client who she owed back rent. She was trying to pay it. So she was trying to work a payment plan out with the lawyer. And she said, I don't want a judgment, which is like, so they can make the agreement without having this thing called the judgment that would then go on her record and would actually affect her credit report. And she'd been working really hard to like have a good credit report, right? She was a low income person, right? This was really meaningful to her. And so she was trying to negotiate this with the landlord's lawyer. And he was like, no, we can't do that. That's just how it works. And she pulls out the book and she shows it to him. And she's like, I know you can do it because it's so right here. And he backed down, right? And so I think that the concreteness of that and being able to know that she was backed up by that in that moment, I think that those moments, like, I don't think that works as well with digital. But I mean, that said, we like digital tools as well, and we're thinking about how to strategically use them, especially to complement some of the other pieces.
Thank you again for your talk and your work, especially. So you kind of mentioned specific ways in which you or people that work with CUP distribute material, but what's kind of like the general practice in trying to reach like, a large group of people? And also my second question is like, how do you get funding and what's that process like?
Yeah. So on the distribution piece, we're always looking at a specific audience. So when people apply to work with us, we ask them like, who's the audience and how are you going to get it to them? And sometimes it's like, oh, this is the kind of organizing we do. Like we do trainings or we do street outreach, but then they'll also often talk about their network. So it's like, oh, we're in a network. So like we work on immigration issues and we're in this network with these other 15 immigration groups or whatever it is. So we're asking them that from the beginning, and we're usually talking about it throughout the process as well. And then, when we're getting towards the end, we think about how to do a launch event that helps them get it out in a pretty public way so people know it's available. But a lot of it then happens through their own, like through their organization or through their partner networks that they do the direct distribution. And for us, that's really important too, right? Because that is part of, like when I mentioned before, this idea of when someone hands it to you to have the trust to really be able to use that information. So much of it comes from the fact that they're receiving it from that group that they have that trust with. And then the second question was about the funding. We have a mix of stuff. Most of our funding is from grants, so a mix of private foundation grants and some government grants. Most of our government grants are arts-based grants. And then we have some fee-for-service work where a group hires us. We use the same criteria to determine who we'll work with, so we wouldn't work with someone whose values don't align with us. Or sometimes, like I mentioned before, that project with Center for Family Life, when they came to us after the election, they had a little bit of money, but then we worked with them to find other grants we could apply for together to do the project, so we do a lot of that too. And then we do general fundraising. So like we're having our annual benefit in 2 weeks, and we do like an annual end of year appeal letter and stuff like that. And that money is great because it's really flexible money. So it actually gives us the flexibility to do things like respond to unexpected projects that seem really critical, without having to wait a long time to apply for a grant. I guess we also sell our projects on our website, so we give them for free to our community partners. But then, like, if you wanted to buy one just to have a copy, you could buy it on our website, and that actually helps our funding as well.
All right. Hello. My question is more about the bilingual projects that you showed us. So I noticed for most of the bilingual projects, you decided to do a English version and a version that's in their original language, like the other language, and you decided to use different color schemes. But for the Chinatown project, you decided to put it all in one pamphlet. What is the reasoning, the rationale behind this choice?
Yeah, so those choices happen with our partners, and they're specific to the project. So we talk about that very early in the project. We talk about what languages is the project going to be in. So like the nail salon one that we did, that's in 4 different languages. We've done ones in 5 different languages. So it really varies. And we talk about that from the beginning, like what's the strategy, like which languages is it going to be in? Are there separate editions or do they all go together? That also partially has to do with the density of information and if we could all fit them together or not. But sometimes it also has to do with the organizing partner and how they're going to distribute it. Like, oh, well, we do our trainings, we do trainings in multiple languages with simultaneous translation, or like we do trainings that are monolingual, so we just want to be able to hand out the Spanish one to like our Spanish folks in those sessions, right? So we talk to them about the strategies that they're using, or if it's like if they're working within a network, then it's like, oh, our partners want to use the Chinese language version and these other partners want to use the Spanish one, so we're not going to do multilingual in this case. Or so we have a lot of conversations that are it's really coming from the partner and the strategies around their organizing.
Hi, thank you, Christine, once again. Thank you for sharing such inspiring social impact and civic engagement projects with us. My question relates to, so for a lot of the educational projects and awareness projects that CUP works on, such as what is zoning and what is FAR, I feel like it might be difficult sometimes to quantify the impact it has on your intended audiences. So my question would be, how would you assess the impact or effect your project has on the people who you are intending to reach?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it looks different for different projects. So actually for the workshops, we do evaluations when we run the workshops. We do pre and post evaluations. So we have people fill out this really quick evaluation at the beginning telling us about what they feel like their level of knowledge is about the topic and their level of confidence in speaking about it. And then we do it again at the end of the workshop and then ask them a couple of other questions just that are around helping us improve the workshops. And that's really interesting. So those numbers are super fascinating because we see big jumps in how confident people feel talking about the project. So for us, we won't know, right? Like we won't be able to measure who goes to a community meeting and participates in that way. But so we're using that as a proxy to understand if like it's helping move them along in that direction, which is like the goal that our partners had identified for that. For the print materials, one of the things that's really hard about our work is that the point of impact is happens after we're not there anymore, and so we have to really rely on our community partners to help us understand what it is. So we do a mix of things. We count distribution numbers, so we have groups come back to us and ask for more copies and things like that, so that helps us know if it's still in use or how many people are using it. We also do annual evaluations with our partners, so we reach out to them and just find out, are you still using it? What's happening when you use it? Can you tell us some stories? Like I talked about Cav telling us stories about impact from that particular project, and so that's more anecdotal. And then we did, so for Making Policy Public last year was our 10-year anniversary. So we hired an evaluator to do like a comprehensive evaluation of the program and reach out to all the partners we'd ever worked with. And so that gave us a bigger picture lens on just even things like how many of the projects are still in use after, many years and things like that. And then now what we're trying to do now is kind of build a bigger system that we could use to kind of look across our projects, but also collect information that we could give to our partners that would be helpful for them too. Because often it's hard to tease out, like if they're doing a broader campaign, our print piece might be part of a bigger campaign that they're doing. So they might also not have the ability to determine like what part of the campaign our particular project influenced, but they might have a sense of the campaign in general. But some groups we work with have very little capacity to do evaluation. So we're working now to try to figure out what would it look like for us to do evaluation in a way that actually benefits them too, so that we're giving them another kind of piece of value for participating with us.
Hi, Christine. Thank you so much for inspiring talk and also bringing a note of critique of how this work can be very inspiring for designers and can be done wrongly. Coming from a designer side, the question is, for designers who are inspired by this work, what is the process of getting in touch with you guys and working with you? What are the capacities that an individual can offer and so on?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think right now we mostly work with designers in New York just because we're meeting a lot in our really inefficient design process. But one of the things that we're actually trying to do now is do more training. So we've had a lot of groups, like both designers and community organizations in other parts of the country, ask us if we could collaborate with them. We feel like we have a limited capacity to do that, and we're also not sure, we don't want to like parachute into a place and be like, this is how you should do stuff. But we've been thinking about ways that we can share our processes and methodologies and say like, here's our best practices, here's what we've learned, and like create a space where others can then take that and adapt it in their own communities. So that's something we're sort of exploring. I think maybe in the next year, we'll probably be offering some sort of kind of initial ideas around doing that. So keep an eye out, sign up for our email list. And we're also doing more trainings for designers specifically. Like I did a training a few weeks ago for designers in New York looking at, we just did it for designers that we're working with now, but I think we might expand it around this issue I mentioned before about thinking about bias in design and especially in illustration and like all the ways that it kind of comes in and how to kind of step back from that and ask questions in your process that help prevent that.
Hi, Christine.
Hi, Kyle.
How are you?
Okay.
I've got 3 questions.
Oh, God, Kyle.
But a couple of them are short. So one, just a quick clarification. Did I understand properly that for the Making Policy Public initiative, I guess I should say, do you guys take proposals from people?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Which sets up kind of my second and third questions. First, I should say that we know each other, but in the past week or so, as I've gotten ready for this event, I've really enjoyed like digging into your work and getting to know it again. And more deeply. And one of the things that I took away from that, one of the things I really appreciated is how you've gotten me thinking about expertise in a different way. In particular, that the expertise exists in communities and that we should see community members as experts in their own lived experience and experts on the places that they live, and that should be valued. On a practical level, in the Making Policy Public project, it's about communicating policy. I'm not an expert on policy, and neither are most designers. It's about kind of communicating a different sort of expertise. So do you work with lawyers?
Unfortunately. But
Are there lawyers as a part of your organization, and what does that relationship look like?
yeah, so it's sort of a mix of stuff. I mean, my undergrad was in policy, so I have a little bit of that. But usually we see the partner organization that we're working with as bringing the expertise on the particular issue, usually because they've been doing a lot of organizing work on it already. Very often, it's kind of a mix. So sometimes we work with groups where it's all lawyers, like when we work with like Bronx defenders or other legal defense groups, which we work with many of. Often, most of the staff are working with our lawyers. I was joking, saying unfortunately, but we really have to fight them on language. So a lot of I didn't even say this, but a lot of what CUP does, we write all the text in these projects, right? So we're writing the copy and we're really trying to think about making it accessible. And often our being outsiders to the topic is what helps us to like come in with like, oh, is this what you're saying? Is this how it works? And actually when we get feedback from our partners, they're often saying, oh, I really knew this issue, but when I had to like answer all the questions that Cup had and go into the detail on it, I realized there were pieces that we didn't understand, or that, the way that we framed it didn't get at everything that like a community member would need to know. So that process itself of opening up the policy and what we know about it is part of what's helpful in the process, I think. But so there are often lawyers there. Sometimes when we're working with just organizing groups, they might have a lawyer that's part of their team, or that reviews it at some point, or that there's like another partner in another organization that brings in the legal expertise. So it varies, but there's usually someone there that has a deep understanding of the policy. And often actually in the projects, the groups want to show it to the city agencies that work on the issues too. And sometimes there's really antagonistic relationships. Sometimes there are really complex layered relationships, but like a lot of times we're seeing more and more that groups want the city agencies to look at it and give their take on it too, and that's a pretty interesting moment too. And sometimes we decide that we don't want to make changes that they would want to make, and sometimes we do. And I think that's an interesting piece about when it becomes usable to them too, seeing the reach of it brought in.
So that's as complicated as I imagined it would be.
Yeah.
Which leads me to my third question, which I think maybe goes back to the first a bit, which is putting yourself for a moment in a position of maybe somebody in this room who might be a young designer. Maybe they're interested in applying for or making a proposal to your organization, or maybe they're interested in simply doing similar kinds of work. To do so would involve crossing several kinds of boundaries and reaching out to other sorts of expertise they wouldn't have direct access to normally, which would be a brave thing to do. I think a difficult thing to do. That would be the community in which they're interested in serving, and then also expert kinds of other forms of professional expertise that they might not themselves have. What advice would you have for a person in that position? Maybe we could frame it in terms of how to make that proposal to your organization, or maybe we could frame it just in terms of how to kind of get by in the world in that way.
Yeah. I mean, I think Dick and Rick touches on this, so I feel like that was part of what we wanted to get at. To me, the most important thing is, if you want to do that work, is to identify what organization is doing that work, right? So, because you don't want to do it on your own, because you can't, like, how are you going to distribute it, or right? Unless you're doing it for a community that you're actively a part of, then it's sort of like, how do you find who's doing this work, and how do you build a relationship with them so that you can support their work? And honestly, I think one of the best ways to do that is to start volunteering or supporting that group in ways that are not specific to the project that you want to do. So you're showing up and you're actually learning about their organization, right, in a very humble way, where you're just showing up and hearing what's going on and starting to understand how they work and what their operations are. And at some point, I think it starts to become clear where, like, you might be able to help them or add value, but you'll also understand how to communicate that to them in a way so that it's not, right, it's not like a colonial thing where you're just sort of showing up and saying, like, I know how to fix a problem that you have. So it's like, how do you build that relationship in a way that respects the work that group is doing and gives them a chance to, opt into it or not? I think that's the ideal way to do that. But I think groups are really, really open to that. And I think they're really excited about design and what it can do, and often feel like they're under-resourced in that way. So I think they are excited for that support, but I think it's about finding a kind of a respectful way to offer that. And if you want to work with us, I think that actually the really nice way especially for newer designers, is through our public access design program, because then you are part of a cohort and there is sort of more structured training to it too. And I think we're going to be offering more kinds of trainings like that in the future too. Someone just has a question right there.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank
It was
you.
Amazing. This is kind of a niche question, but I noticed all of your projects have amazing use of a variety of different fonts. I was wondering, what's like I know there's a deeper meaning between the choice of what fonts you use for different things. So maybe you could explain kind of the thought processes as you, as a designer and the team, are thinking of when they choose that.
Yeah, I mean, we just talk a lot about it with our partners, and we ask. I mean, part of what we're doing that I think is powerful is, when people look at a design proposal, they don't always know what to say, right? Especially if they've never worked in design, their sort of inclination is to either be like, I like it, I don't like it, and they don't quite know, and it's scary. So one thing we do is we try to ask designers to, especially early in the process, to have multiple proposals so that we can also have comparative conversations. Those are often easier for people. But then our staff will ask them a lot of questions to also try to break it down. So we'll say like, oh, this color palette is like kind of more like greens and it's muted, and this one has a lot of color. What do you think about those? How do you read them? And then we do that a lot with typography. And that's really fun because people have strong, most of the time we'll walk into a room and people would not feel like they can talk about typography, but if you start asking them the right questions, they have strong feelings. And it's great. I love it. But I was talking to a friend recently who is working on a project, not a cup project, but a project with another community group. And someone had made a visual proposal and they were looking at it and people were like, I don't like the font, and everyone felt uncomfortable about the font and no one could articulate why. And then someone was like, oh my God, that is the font that NYPD uses. And so everyone's like, yeah, let's not use that. But people could read it even though they couldn't articulate it. There is an affiliation in their head that didn't feel right. And so it's really fun to make space where you can kind of tease that out and have those conversations. But a lot of it it comes from that. It comes from having the partners, community members talk it through. Thank you.